Okay, great. So, good. So, welcome everyone. Tonight we're going to be talking about insulin resistance, the hidden killer. And I'm going to be taking you through a lot of different information. So, again, what I was just saying is write your questions down, and I'll definitely answer them for you at the end. Okay, and then let me just mute everybody out on the phone so I don't get an echo here. Let's see. Although some of you are on the host code because that's what I dished out to you in the email. Let me just go in here and mute everybody up. Good. Okay, so we're all muted. Okay, so what is insulin? Insulin is a hormone that is made by the pancreas. And your pancreas is a gland. It's located right around your stomach area. And what insulin does is it signals your muscle cells and your adipose tissue. Your adipose tissue is fat that surrounds your organs, to take up glucose to use for energy or to store for later use. So it's either going to tell the cell to take it in because you need to make energy for life processes like breathing and your heart beating or exercise, and then also for your brain to function, or it's going to tell your liver to take up that glucose to store for later use, or your fat cells to take up that glucose and store it for later use. It signals cells to make proteins, so very important. That's what most of our body is made out of, our cells and our muscle tissues and our organs. It helps to regulate potassium and phosphorus in cells. Now that's very important because that has a lot to do with hydration. And so it regulates basically, I'm sure you guys have heard about electrolytes. It regulates the electrolytes in your cells. And it signals the liver to store glucose as glycogen, which is a form of sugar that can be used for energy later. Plus, there's a whole lot of other processes that insulin is involved in that we're not going to be talking about tonight. So before we get into that, I want to talk about what is a hormone. A hormone is a chemical messenger. It's just like the mailman that shows up at your house, puts the mail in your mailbox. Well, hormones act like the mailman. So every cell has specific receptors on them for specific hormones. So like in women, our ovaries have, the cells in our ovaries have very specific receptors on the outside that bind with estrogen. And they're the only cells in the body that have that particular receptor. So if you look at this slide, I got my handy dandy little pen here. This would be a receptor. And then this is the hormone, and you can see the shape corresponds. Now this is a very simple diagram, but that's actually how it works. Enzymes and receptors work like locks and keys. You can't put the key to your car in the key to your doorknob on your house. It's not going to work. And it's the same thing with hormones and receptors. So every cell has specific receptors for specific hormones. And our muscle cells have specific receptors for insulin. Our fat cells have specific receptors for insulin. Our liver cells have specific receptors for insulin as well, right? So it acts as a chemical messenger. Now, once it binds to that receptor, it actually tells the cell to do something very specific. So it's like a little leader that's traveling through your bloodstream, that's going to a cell, that's giving it a very specific command. And every hormone in your body has different functions. Like adrenaline, which is produced by the adrenal glands, is responsible for the fight or flight response, right? So if you saw a lion coming at you, if a lion just stepped into your office or your house, you would all of a sudden have the fight or flight response. And certain things would happen in your body because adrenaline is being pumped out. So the same thing with insulin. And insulin is produced in a gland called the pancreas. Now, what is glucose? Glucose is a very simple sugar. It's the smallest type of sugar, and it's a very important energy source in living organisms. And it's a component of many carbohydrates. So with carbohydrates, you've got simple carbohydrates, you've got complex carbohydrates. You've probably heard those terms before. Well, what does that actually look like scientifically? This is a picture of a complex carbohydrate. So this is the actual chemical structure of cellulose. Cellulose is found in a lot of plants. Cellulose is actually what makes up the cell walls of plant cells. So when you're eating celery and it's crunching, that's actually cellulose that's doing that. When cellulose is broken down by the body, it's broken down into glucose. So I wanted to show you this diagram, not to give you the scientific structure, but so you could see that glucose is much smaller than cellulose. And cellulose is actually made up of glucose. So it's kind of like, if you think of it as Legos, cellulose is one Lego, or glucose is one Lego, and cellulose is like the whole castle that you've just built. And then once that castle is digested, it's going to be broken down by the body. So glucose is basically the fuel for the body. And I thought this was kind of funny because you got this jogger who's, about to pass out, and he's going to get some sugar because he wants to get some immediate energy, right? And he doesn't want complex carbohydrates because he wants his cells to be completely fueled quickly. And that's what you would do if you were in intensive exercise. Now, unfortunately, a lot of people consume a lot of this sugar throughout their day without intensive exercise. And we're going to be talking about what happens in the body when we do that. And it's actually pretty fascinating. Once you understand it, it makes a lot of sense about why we gain weight when we've got a lot of sugar being pushed into our body. And if you think about it this way, if you went to fill your car up at the gas station and you put the little nozzle in your gas tank, and then when it's full, it shuts off, right? Well, we do have a mechanism for shutting it off when we are eating correctly, and that's called that full feeling, right? When you feel full and your brain triggers you to stop eating. When we're eating a lot of sugar, what happens is that gas pump doesn't shut off. So if you imagine if the gas pump didn't shut off, if you're like me, I don't stand around watching gas. I get back in my car, I look at my phone, I play a game, I do, a million things while my gas is pumping in my car, just trusting that it's automatically going to shut off. Well, if it didn't automatically shut off, you would have gas everywhere, and it would be a huge hazard. Well, that's what it's like when you're consuming too much simple sugars in your diet. So when you eat food, the digestion process actually starts in your mouth, right, with saliva. So you eat something, your taste buds activate your brain, they start chemical reactions. Taste buds aren't just about your food tasting good, they're also about signaling your brain that certain foods are coming, that salty foods are coming, the sweet foods are coming, and the components of those are coming to the body. So let's say you put an apple in your mouth, or you put bread in your mouth, or whatever. So the digestion process starts in your mouth, it continues in your stomach, and then by the time it gets to your small intestine is when the food is broken down and it's being absorbed. And in your intestine, there's all these little finger-like structures called villi, and the villi are filled with, thousands of capillaries. And in those capillaries are your red blood cells. And the food and the nutrients are being absorbed through the villi, or the toxins, right, depending on what's in your food, are being absorbed in the villi into your bloodstream. And then your body is actually going to take action on that. So glucose enters the bloodstream from the small intestine. The blood then carries the glucose to muscles and to the brain. So glucose is also what fuels your brain. And I'll explain to you why having too much of that is really, really not good. So this process this is what it looks like. And I'm going to guide you through this diagram with my handy dandy little pen here so that it's not confusing. So right here we've got a word that says homeostasis. Homeostasis means that your body is in balance and all of your systems are operating correctly. They're doing what they're supposed to be doing, and your metabolism is working correctly, your body is working correctly. So blood glucose levels rise after eating. So right here, you eat something and your blood glucose rises. So when the blood glucose goes up and you've got sugar increased in your bloodstream, your pancreas releases insulin. And the insulin does two things. One, it's going to signal your body cells to take up the glucose and convert it into a molecule called ATP. And ATP is actually like the gas for your car. It's what your cells actually use for energy. It's the end product. Or it's going to tell your liver to take up the glucose and store as glycogen. Now, anything that's left over is actually going to go into your body fat. It's going to be turned into triglycerides, which if you've had any type of heart panel done at a doctor's office, they always talk about triglycerides. And those triglycerides are stored as body fat around your organs. Now, and then when the blood glucose level drops below a certain point, so let's say you're heavy into exercise and your body now needs the glucose for energy, the pancreas releases the glucagon, which is a complementary hormone to insulin, and the liver is going to break down that glucagon into glucose, and that's going to go into your bloodstream. And this is a very balanced process. Your body is a perfectly working machine, and it does this cycle day in, day out. Now, what can throw this off of balance, what can actually cancel this balance, is when you've got a high level of glucose in your blood all the time, right? Because then the system doesn't get to do what it's supposed to do. It never gets to the point where it needs to break down the glycogen, which creates all kinds of problems for your liver. By the way, if you've ever heard of fatty liver disease, that's actually a result of this process not happening correctly. So let's take a look at what healthy cells look like. So this would be a diagram of a healthy cell, and I'm going to point out a couple of points on here for you so you know what you're looking at. So this right here, this outer part, this is your cell membrane. That's the outside of your cell. And this right here is the inside of your cell. And this is millions of cells in your body. Okay, this particularly, we're looking right here, this diagram is based on a muscle cell. And then these little red dots are glucose, so those are sugars that have been broken down. And these little blue hexagons are insulin. And this right here, this blue structure, is an insulin receptor. So this is like the lock, and the insulin is the key. And what happens when the insulin binds with the receptor is it opens up this little door right here so that glucose can get in. And that's how glucose gets into your cells. So insulin binds to the receptor, it opens up the little door, and glucose comes in. If insulin can't bind to it, then the little door doesn't open and glucose doesn't come in. So it acts as a gateway into your cell with glucose. Now this diagram is very important because I'm going to show you what an unhealthy cell looks like and how insulin resistance actually takes place. And I just want to check one thing. Okay, good. Okay, so before we go on, and this is very important because this is going to explain what the actual glycemic index is. Now, you've probably heard of the glycemic index, and a lot of times when I'm talking to people, they'll mention it and I'll ask them, do you know what the glycemic index is? And they say, well, it's a measure of how many carbohydrates are in food. And that's accurate, but it's also inaccurate. The glycemic index is actually a measure of how quickly the carbohydrates in the food are broken down in your body, making the glucose available to your cells. So things with high GI are broken down very quickly, and there's a lot of glucose in it. So a lot of glucose goes immediately into your bloodstream. And a low glycemic index means that the carbohydrates are broken down slower, so there's a less amount of glucose in your body in a certain amount of time. So it has a lot to do with how much carbohydrates are in a food, but it also has a lot to do with how quickly they're broken down and that glucose goes into your bloodstream. This is what it looks like. Let me just check something here real quick. Okay. So this is what it looks like when someone eats a high GI food, carbohydrate, like a donut, versus a low GI carbohydrate food like an apple. So what you're looking at is this is the change on the right-hand side. This is the change. This is the change in your blood sugar, and this is the amount of time. So you can see if somebody were to eat like a donut, in 30 minutes, their glucose level is going to spike up like crazy. Versus if they eat an apple, it's going to go up a little bit, but then it's going to go back down the way that it would normally, right? Now what happens here, and I'm gonna show you a diagram in a second, not only does your insulin level spike, but if you look at this black line, so does, not only does your glucose level spike, so does your insulin level. So the insulin level goes up, and the closer it is to normal, the less drop you're going to have, the less tired you're going to feel, the less crabby you'll feel, the less cravings you'll have. So when we have really intense spikes like this, it sets off a chemical reaction in our body that causes all kinds of things like the cravings, the crabbiness, the tired, the fatigue, all of that. Now, this is what blood glucose looks like in a person who has diabetes and a person who is normal after digestion. Now, for those women on the line who have had kids, and you've ever had to take that totally disgusting blood glucose test that they use for gestational diabetes, this is actually what they're measuring. They're measuring to see how much glucose you have in your blood after certain amounts of time. So with a normal person, you might have a little bit of a peak, but then it's going to go right back down to the normal range within 2 hours. With somebody that's got diabetes, they're going to have a substantial peak. They're going to have a substantial peak, and then it's not going to go back to normal. So you'll see that if this is the baseline, this is above normal after 2 hours. So that means that the glucose is not being absorbed into the cells properly. And that all starts with insulin resistance and what we also know of as prediabetes. And with prediabetes, that's one of the things that they're looking at, is how long it's taking for your glucose levels to get back down to normal. So this is what it looks like with insulin and blood sugar in your diet. And these are a lot of graphs. But so let's say you have a donut for breakfast, right? Or a bagel, or sugary cereal, or French toast, or pancakes, right? So you have something that has a lot of available sugar. It's very quickly broken down by the body. So your blood sugar, let me go to a different color. Your blood sugar is going to go up, and so is this insulin level. Well, what's going to happen is the insulin is going to pump out so fast, it's going to get the glucose into the cells as quickly as possible, and then your blood sugar is going to drop. And during that blood sugar dropping is when you're going to get the cravings, the fatigue, that feeling of mental fogginess, right? If you've ever noticed in the afternoon that you feel like you're just not as alert, or you can't think as clearly, or you forget where you put your keys, or just things that you commonly can do when you're well rested and well fed, they start to dissipate. And this process happens multiple times throughout the day until at night you're extremely fatigued, your body is nutritionally deficient, and your brain has experienced glucose ups and downs all day long. So where does all the sugar go? The sugar goes into the muscle cells to be converted to cellular energy. That's that ATP I was telling you about. And how much is taken into the muscle cells depends on your activity level, and it also depends on the ability of your cells to respond to insulin. So if you have a healthy cell and all of the receptors are active, then it can respond to insulin very effectively, and it can pull in that glucose. If it's not used for energy, it's converted in the liver to glycogen, it's turned into triglycerides that are stored as fat, or that circulate in the blood causing high cholesterol, or the glucose remains in the bloodstream causing damage. So if you've ever heard about diabetes, right, or people who are diabetic that have things like foot ulcers, or they have to get amputations, the reason that that happens is when you have too much glucose in your capillaries, in your blood vessels, they actually start to rot from the inside out. So they start to rot, then they start to actually collapse, and the blood can no longer get through them. So with diabetics, they're very cautious about things like foot sores, foot blisters, because the blood actually can't get to the tissue with all of the healing agents. And that infection becomes a major problem, and the cells actually start to die in that area, and that can lead to amputation. It can also lead to blindness. And now they're actually starting to call Alzheimer's diabetes type 3, because they're conclusively linking fluctuations in glucose levels, including high glucose in the bloodstream, to damage in the neurons in the brain. So over time, what happens when you have that up and down and up and down and up and down, the cells become resistant to insulin, and they're unable to take in glucose efficiently. It's kind of like the kid who yells fire, right? You're told as a kid, don't say fire if there's not really a fire, because then if you say it next time, the fireman's not going to come. I don't know if you guys were told that, but I was told that, right? You never say fire unless there's a fire. Well, it's the same thing with insulin, right? Insulin should only work in your body when it's really needed to work in your body. Unfortunately, because of the high carbohydrate diet that we have here, especially starting as children, our insulin levels are so high and our glucose levels are so high, and the fluctuations are so intense day in and day out, that our cells actually become desensitized to insulin. And worse than that, the pancreas becomes damaged from overworking and is not able to produce insulin efficiently. So this is what insulin resistance looks like. And currently, the current estimates are that 2/3 of Americans are currently suffering from insulin resistance. Now, insulin resistance is the first step into what's called metabolic disorder. And metabolic disorder is when somebody has high cholesterol, high blood pressure, and the beginnings of heart disease, as well as developing obesity, right? So the words on here, if you can't read them, insulin resistance: fatigue, constant hunger, inability to lose weight, cravings for sugar, fatigue after meals, migrating aches and pains, upper abdominal obesity, meaning in your stomach area, high cholesterol and triglycerides, hormone imbalances, particularly true in women, because estrogen, the way estrogen works in our body, it's very much linked to other hormones. And insulin resistance can actually cause or contribute to polycystic ovarian syndrome. And that can lead to facial hair, infertility, acne, and all kinds of problems with women. Insulin resistance can also lead to estrogen dominance, low thyroid, and increased fat storage. So if you've had any of those symptoms, then you may be suffering with insulin resistance. On a cycle, this is what it looks like. So you eat food, you make insulin, the cells resist the insulin, the sugar is stored as fat, you feel tired and hungry because the cells can't take in the glucose the way that they're supposed to, so they're not producing the energy at the rate that your cells would like to or are designed to, and the sugar is just being stored as fat. So you're getting heavier, and at the same time you're feeling tired and hungry, so you're eating more, right? So now you're tired, you're hungry, you think you eat more, you make more insulin, the cells resist insulin, and this cycle happens over and over and over again. Now, why does that happen? Going back to our picture of our cell, so remember, this is your cell membrane here, which, by the way, that cell membrane is made up of lipids and proteins. The membrane here that you see that looks like a sandwich, that's actually fat, right? And that's healthy fats. That's why fat-free diets are so disastrous and why they slow down your metabolism, because they actually cause damage to your cells. You need healthy fats to maintain the health of your cells. This is the inside of your cell. So here you can see you've got actual damage and inactivity in these insulin receptors because they become numb to the amount of insulin that's been coming into your body. And at some point, for the safety of your cells, they turn off. Because if your cells took in too much glucose, the cells would actually become damaged and they would die. So instead of allowing the cell to die, to be damaged, the receptors actually shut off and they become desensitized. So you can see the little gateway is closed and the receptors are blocked. So now you've got less active receptors, less glucose coming in, and all of this free glucose is now going to be stored as fat. So that's insulin resistance. And I'm going to tell you the simple steps to actually help to reduce and repair that. Because your cells are replicating all the time. That's the good news. Your cells are repairing and replicating. So you can get new healthy cells, and we want to support the growth of those healthy cells as much as possible. So this diagram is just another diagram explaining exactly what happens. So we've got two pictures going on here. I'm just going to cut this off here. This is a picture of your blood vessel carrying your blood. This is a picture of insulin that came in from your pancreas. This is a picture of glucose. So in a normal use of glucose, the insulin is going to leave the bloodstream, it's going to bind to the cell, and the glucose is going to also leave the bloodstream, and it's going to go into the cell, right? So you've got, right here is your cell membrane. You can see that. So this is the outside of your cell. And then you've got the insulin that is actually binding and the glucose coming in. Now, when insulin is unable to bind to the cell down here at the bottom, then glucose can't come in. So it remains in your bloodstream. It's either going to go to your liver, or it's going to go to your fat tissues, or it's going to, worst case scenario, it's going to remain in your blood vessels, where it can cause a significant amount of damage. What can insulin resistance lead to? Well, low HDL, or the good cholesterol. It can lead to increased blood clots because if the glucose is staying in your capillaries, it can actually cause your blood cells to start clotting because it blocks the passageways. Arteriosclerosis is actually the hardening of the arteries, right? So when people talk about they've got arteriosclerosis or hardening of the arteries, that is actually a precursor to heart attacks, to strokes, and to vascular disease, where people get numbness and they get a lot of nerve damage in their hands and their arms. Polycystic ovarian disease, sleep apnea has been linked to insulin resistance, primarily because sleep apnea is caused by an abnormal structure in the body. So if somebody's belly is too large and it's compressing on their diaphragm, it affects the whole respiratory system. Inflammation of the liver, it can actually cause cirrhosis of the liver. Now, cirrhosis of the liver was primarily attributed to alcoholism, but now with fatty liver disease and damage caused by the amount of fat that's being produced by the liver and surrounding the liver can actually lead to cirrhosis. Elevated triglycerides, that's when you've got like high cholesterol, hypertension, high blood pressure, elevated blood sugar, which is kind of like duh, right? If your insulin can't work, then you're going to have too much glucose in your blood system. And neurological changes. Now, some of the biggest problems with having too much glucose in your system is kidney damage and neurological damage. So glucose in the bloodstream actually can cause damage to the nerves. It can block how they respond with each other, and it can actually damage the nerve tips. So that's why they're now linking insulin resistance to Alzheimer's, and the rate of Alzheimer's has increased dramatically since the 1950s. I mean, it is shocking the rate when you look at the actual graphical data of it, the amount that Alzheimer's has increased. Not just Alzheimer's, but ADD, ADHD, autism in children, kidney disease, breast cancer has increased. Cancers in children over 40% increase. I mean, all of these diseases, many of them have been attributed to the damage that's caused by sugars in the body, because then your body can't operate correctly, right? So the damage caused by the glucose levels, I went through a lot of this already on the last chart, but a couple that I didn't mention is fibromyalgia. Fibromyalgia is a syndrome. It's not actually been classified as a disease. It's a syndrome of unidentified caused, localized, and migrating pain. So what that means is, wow, I've got this constant pain in my arm, and it won't go away. Now I've got a constant pain in my shoulder, and that won't go away. Now I've got a constant pain in my leg. Well, if you think about what we just talked about with glucose and how it can stay in the bloodstream and it can damage the actual flow of blood, when you don't have enough blood or oxygen in a certain area of your body responds with pain. And if that glucose is actually damaging nerves, then nerve damage can result in pain as well. They've now conclusively done a number of studies linking depression to insulin resistance, which also makes sense because if your cells can't take in the glucose and they can't make the energy, then you're not going to have enough energy for your daily functions. In addition, if glucose cannot properly get to your brain, then and oxygen can't get to your brain because the capillaries are being blocked, then your brain isn't going to function properly. That's just simple biological math, right? Simple biological math. If oxygen and sugars can't get to your brain cells, they're not going to operate the way that they should. And then ADD and ADHD. Now, this is kind of shocking. This next slide I'm going to show you. So these are the top 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, top 8 leading causes of death. 7 out of them have been linked to insulin resistance and high levels of glucose in the blood. Heart disease, insulin resistance, if you remember, causes a lot of the precursors like hypertension, high cholesterol, all of that. It also can cause estrogen dominance, which in females, estrogen dominance is a leading precursor to female cancers, breast cancer, ovarian cancer, and uterine cancer. Now, sometimes when I'm talking to people, they'll say, well, a lot of that has to do with genes. Now, I could do a whole nother presentation on a very fascinating field called epigenetics. And epigenetics basically is the study of turning genes on and turning genes off. So what turns them on and what turns them off. So for example, in a family, right, let's say you've got 3 sisters. And my mother-in-law is a great example of this. She's one of 3 sisters, and every one of those sisters has exactly the same DNA. The father gave half the DNA, the mother gave half the DNA. They have exactly the same DNA. The difference in their DNA is what genes are turned on and what genes are turned off. And all humans have essentially the same DNA. And like if they were doing a DNA test, what they're basically measuring for is genetic markers. What genes are on, what genes are off. What genes you have, what genes you don't. So in the field of epigenetics, there's a lot of emerging studies about environmental influences on turning genes on and turning genes off. So what would be an example of that? Well, in my mother-in-law's family, my mother-in-law and her sister Steffi are normal weight, have been for their entire life. They're just normal weight. Their sister Jerry was almost 300 pounds, and she had gastric bypass surgery and then gained a lot of that weight back, right? So why would Jerry be so overweight while Tina and Steffi are normal weight, normal metabolism? Well, one is pretty obvious. The foods they eat are very, very different. Jerry tends to eat a very carbohydrate-rich diet. Tina and Steffi tend to eat a very organic, vegetable, and meat-based diet. So right there, right, and now Jerry would say, well, my genes, I got the genes, but Jerry's mother and father were normal size, right? So now what they're studying is it isn't necessarily somebody's genetics that makes them obese, but instead it's the environmental factors that contribute to that. Particularly, you know, they've done some studies of families where the mother and the father are overweight, and then the kids are overweight. Now, is it genetics, or is it the fact that their diet is made up of 90% processed food? Right? They're not eating normal, healthy food. So it's not the genes that are making the kids fat, it's actually the food in the home that's triggering the effects that their genetics, they might have a predisposition. And certain nationalities do have a predisposition to gaining weight with carbohydrates. because genetically, historically, over the millennium, that was not their diet, right? They did not grow up on potatoes. A classic example of that would be African Americans. African Americans that have actual African heritage are very susceptible to high-fat, high-carbohydrate diets for weight gain. Because in Africa, that is not the natural diet. The natural diet is vegetable and legume-based and meat-based, right? Chronic lower respiratory diseases. Now, why would this be attributed to insulin resistance? Because insulin resistance and diabetes actually substantially suppresses your immune system. And if you don't have enough circulation in your body, your immune system cannot function properly. Stroke. Stroke has been conclusively linked to insulin resistance. Why? Well, a stroke is caused by a lack of oxygen to the brain. If your arteries and your capillaries are not functioning properly, oxygen cannot get to the brain. And if you're substantially obese or overweight, and not all strokes, but insulin resistance has been attributed to a cause of strokes, right? If you're severely overweight, when you're sleeping, your body cannot respirate the proper way. So you're not getting the maximum amount of oxygen in, and you're not exhaling the maximum amount of carbon dioxide out. And if you're not exercising, then you're not getting maximum circulation either. Alzheimer's disease, a lot of emerging research on insulin resistance and Alzheimer's disease. Diabetes, shockingly, is the number 7 cause of death here in the United States, and it is also extremely preventable, right? It is type 2 diabetes is completely diet related. Is there some genetic predisposition? Yes, but it has everything to do with diet. So are some people more susceptible to the damages of carbohydrates than others? Definitely. But if they're eating a healthy, like paleo type diet, it's going to greatly reduce the amount of diabetes here. So seeing that, now interestingly enough, I was looking at some of the leading causes of death over the last century. And in the 1920s and in like 1930s, 1940s, diabetes wasn't even on the map for cause of death. Back then it was like tuberculosis, diphtheria, things like that. So now we have modern medicine for that, but the result is other things like diabetes have taken a lead. And then nephritis, nephrotic syndrome, and nephrosis, this is damage to the kidneys. This means that there's been severe kidney damage, which can definitely be attributed to diabetes and insulin resistance and dehydration, right? Plus, now with a lot of food additives, the kidneys simply cannot handle the toxic load. They just cannot do it. This is a little bit of a complex diagram, but it shows you up here. I'm going to lead you through this. Okay, so here we've got insulin resistance. Genetic influences can attribute to it, and then environmental influences, like the food you eat, the amount of stress your body is under, the amount of toxin stress, right? If somebody is dealing with toxins all day long, like they're a cleaning person or they're working in a chemical factory, right, that's going to definitely have an effect on how their body can perform. Hyperinsulinemia just means you've got an increase in insulin, right? So anything that's hyper is too much. Anything that's hypo is too little, right? So you've got hyperinsulinemia. And what that leads to is glucose intolerance. So your body can't take in the glucose. You got increased triglycerides, right, which we see on blood tests. You've got the decrease in the good cholesterol. And then you've got an increase in the bad cholesterol. And then what this is right here, this is actually a protein in your body that is increased that can signal all kinds of problems. And then you get increased blood pressure and cardiovascular disease. So it's all linked together, and it all starts with sugar. A Harvard study linked sugary drinks to 180,000 deaths per year. Isn't that crazy? So sugar-sweetened beverages are linked to more than 180,000 obesity-related deaths worldwide each year, according to a new research presented this week at the American Heart Association conference. Now, this is recent. This is 2014. This means about 1 in every 100 deaths from obesity-related diseases is caused by drinking sugary beverages. So how much sugar should an adult consume? Well, a healthy adult with a normal BMI should consume a maximum of 25 grams of sugar per day. And I just put a couple of examples on here of how much sugar is in some of these things. So 1 can of Coke has 39 grams of sugar. If you think about the people that leave like the 7-Elevens and stuff with their big gulp of Pepsi or the big gulp of Diet Coke, or not Diet Coke, but like Dr. Pepper or something, that's got over 100 grams of sugar in it. So they're having 4 times the amount of sugar that they should have in one day in one serving. 1 Snickers bar, 29 grams of sugar. Yoplait, 26 grams of sugar. Chobani, which is a healthier alternative, but that's got 15 grams of sugar. So if you had one of those, then you'd have to be really, really careful throughout the day, right? Now, on our particular program, we're just going to stay away from sugar altogether, because what we want to do is we want to have even insulin and blood glucose levels. Because by having even glucose and blood insulin levels, your cells that are now being developed and are maturing are going to be able to have healthy insulin receptors. And they're not going to be bombarded by insulin all day, every day. So then when you do have a piece of cake once in a while and your blood sugar goes up, your body's going to be able to use that sugar efficiently or just burn it off, right? Because you're not doing it 3 times a day, every day. Now, what about artificial sweeteners? People ask me about this all the time. Besides the fact that they're chemicals and they're toxic, recent studies have found that artificial sweeteners actually do spike your insulin. And they don't know exactly why that mechanism happens, but the theory is that it starts in the mouth with the taste buds. So the taste buds, because they're tasting something sugary, signal to the brain that sugar is coming. And then the brain signals to the pancreas to start producing insulin because sugar is on the way. So what does that mean? Well, the terrible, terrible downside is that all of this insulin gets pushed into your blood. It's hammering up against your cells, against the receptors, but there's no glucose. So that's another theory about why insulin resistance actually happens, is because over time, as the hormone insulin binds to the receptor, if glucose doesn't go through that doorway, the insulin permanently is bound to the receptor, and then the receptor is damaged and it begins to just break down because it's not doing what it's supposed to be doing and something is wrong. And in your body, when something is wrong, your body starts to get rid of it, right? Your immune cells will attack and the body starts to dissipate because your body really is a perfect system for keeping you healthy. So this is a very, very revealing study about why people, when a lot of people will cut out sugar and they'll just use artificial sweeteners, they don't lose weight. Well, the reason is because artificial sweeteners do not help to counter the effect of insulin resistance, because they're still raising the amount of insulin that's going into the bloodstream, and they're artificially signaling cells to absorb something that's not going to be there. So what's the solution? Well, in our society, what most people do is they get medical prescriptions, right? These shocking, shocking statistics. 75% of the world's pharmaceuticals are produced here in the United States, and 55% of them are consumed in the United States. So it's a 300 to 400 billion per year industry internationally. In the United States, this graph at the bottom, in the United States pays approximately $1,000 per person per year on prescription drugs. So now I don't take any prescription drugs, and I haven't for a very, very long time. So if my $1,000 isn't here, that means someone else is taking $2,000 worth of prescription drugs. We are almost double the next highest country, which is Canada. Why is that? Because we are also number 40 in terms of national health. Not health care, but national health. And I challenge you to, just off your head, name 40 countries, right? I could barely do it, right? To name 40 countries, and those 40 countries are ahead of us in terms of national health. What's really sad to me is that the number of deaths that we saw here from all of these diseases, which can be related to diets that are very high in processed foods and sugars, all of these combined, if you were to take, and just in the United States, over 200,000 death certificates were dished out in 2007 that listed diabetes or obesity as a related cause. So over 200,000. The number of deaths from drug overdoses was 17,000. The number of deaths from gun-related deaths was about 30,000. Yet so much media and so much money goes into campaigns against illegal drugs and against, for gun control and for all these things. Now, I'm not saying we should legalize drugs, and I'm not saying anything about gun control. What I'm saying is, why are we as a nation not putting as much money into fighting big business on sugar and really letting people know about what's in their food? So what are the natural solutions? The natural solutions are eating a whole food, low sugar, paleo-based diet. And paleo-based just basically means you're eating stuff that's close to the ground. So it either came out of the ground or it ate it out of the ground. That's it, right? So those are the two things. It either grew out of the ground or it ate it out of the ground. That's a paleo diet, in summary. And you're having proper nutritional supplementation, because nowadays, even if it's grown out of the ground, because of our farming practices, it doesn't have the same nutritional content as it did 100 years ago. And particularly when we are in recovery, when we're in recovering our health, we want to give our bodies the maximum nutrition so that it has everything it needs without a doubt, and we want to detoxify, right? And we can also alkalize, which is a whole nother topic, which is about keeping our pH at a certain level. Also, we want to keep our circulation going with cardio, and we want to increase the amount that our cells can use glucose with strength training. The more strength training you do or resistance exercising you do, the more those muscle cells are going to pull in glucose. Because when muscle cells are in need of glucose, they can actually bypass insulin, and they can pull it right out of the cells, or pull it right out of the bloodstream too. And you want to reduce your stress. And I know some people on the line might be laughing. In fact, I was at my naturopath today, and she was like, "Shannon, you got to reduce your stress." And I looked at her, and she goes, "I know with a 3-year-old." I said, "Look, I'm working on it. I am working on it, right? So you got to reduce your stress." And I said, "Okay, so what are stressors?" Well, there's physical stressors, there's emotional stressors, and there's chemical stressors. Chemical stressors are probably about the easiest for us to control, because you can just stop eating anything with food additives, and you can get rid of products in your home that have toxic chemicals. Cleaning agents, body care products, shampoos, things like that. Particularly with shampoos and body lotions and stuff like that, you want to look for things called parabens. Parabens are very dangerous, and for women especially, they affect our estrogen levels. And you want to get plenty of good sleep. Rest is so important for our body because it's the mechanism by which our body can heal, it can rejuvenate, it rebalances during good sleep. But a lot of that has to do with giving yourself the proper nutrition and also reducing your stress. So that's the end of the presentation for tonight. Let me just shut down this recording. And